what Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai does is he takes the perspective of the Zealots and he hides it in the Kabbalistic literature, which the Romans can't really understand or read, and even that wasn't so accessible, right? And what happens to this? This Torah, what we call the Kabbala, remains for centuries the exclusive property of giants, right? You have, and you have different ways of understanding it. You know, in a lot of the Arabic-speaking world, you had Chachamim who approached the Kabbalah one way. In Europe, you have the Baal Shem Tov and his students, a later movement called Hasidim that's not connected at all to the Hasidim of the Second Temple period, and they basically turned the Kabbalistic literature into a psychology. But then you have another group, which includes, I think, Rabbi Yehuda Levi and the Ramban and the Ramchal and the Maharal of Prague and the Gaon of Vilna and eventually Rav Kook, who we can say returned the ideas of the Kabbalah back into a philosophy. Okay, meaning they're kind of unpacking it in its most authentic way. But that also remained the property of very few giants of Torah. That wasn't widespread, meaning that wasn't something that every Jew understood, every Jew learned, right? There are all these ideas, you can't learn until you're 40, and even then, who can understand it, right? So you have these giants who understood it, and even Rav Kook, right, who's alive for the Zionist movement, who is explaining the Zionist movement from a divine perspective, what's going on. Not that Ben Gurion or Herzl or Ahad Ha'am or Jabotinsky knew what they were doing, but that Hashem is doing something through them, and that's what Rav Kook says we need to understand. What the Kadosh Baruch Hu is doing here. But even Rav Kook, how many students did Rav Kook really have? 3, 4? Real students, real Talmidim who understood his teachings and went and spread them. 3, 4 students, Berach, right? But in the time of his top student, his son, Rav Yehuda Hakohen Kook, something happened. Remember, the Torah, the Torah of the Zealots, when did it go underground? When did it start hiding from us? When did it become inaccessible? Pretty much when we lost Yerushalayim.
After the bar-Kokhba rebellion?
Yeah, we'll start with the Great Revolt and losing the temple. But then in the bar-Kokhba revolt, we had Jerusalem again. We possessed Jerusalem again, and then we lost it. And around then is when, again, Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai goes and hides in the cave, and he encodes all this in the Zohar HaKadosh. The Zohar HaKadosh says that the Shekhinah will not return to Yerushalayim Shel Mala until Am Yisrael returns to Yerushalayim Shel Mata. Meaning when we say Shel Mala, we can say like the code, right? Let's say this world, let's pretend this world we occupy is a website, and there's code behind the website. And that's what the Torah is teaching us often, right? The plumbing behind the faucet, the code behind the website. There's a terrestrial Jerusalem, the mountain city that we sometimes, technically we're in it now because the borders of Jerusalem include Kiryat Moshe today, but certainly, Yerushalayim between the walls, right? That's the mountain city, that's terrestrial Jerusalem. But then there's also celestial Jerusalem, right? Like, for example, when Yaakov had his dream on my mountain, the mountain was Luz, that was next to Luz, right? It says, according to Rashi, that Yerushalayim Shel Mala, the back end of Jerusalem, the code of Jerusalem, met Yaakov in material Luz, and the meeting between the code of Jerusalem and the front end of Luz became Beit El. And then he started calling it Beit El, right? And that's why we call it Beit El. So it's just how the interaction. So it says in the Zohar HaKadosh that the Shekhinah won't return to Yerushalayim, the code, Shel Mala, until Am Yisrael returns to Yerushalayim Shel Mata. So what happened? What happened is 19 years after we survived but lost the War of 48, right? We lost Yerushalayim. History opens a door, and we have to fight Egypt and Syria and Jordan. in the Six-Day War. We returned to Jerusalem, right? The paratroopers conquered Jerusalem. We returned to Jerusalem on the 28th of Iyar, which B'ezrat Hashem will celebrate in a couple of weeks. We come back to Yerushalayim. And what happens then? This Torah that had been the exclusive property of a tiny minority of Chachamim becomes accessible. All these institutions teaching the Torah of Rav Kook, what we call the Torah of Rav Kook, is essentially the Torah of Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai, Rabbi Akiva, right? Which the Torah of the Maharal, the Torah of the Ramchal, the Torah of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, the Torah of the Vilna Gaon, right? And this Torah of Rav Kook was still hard for anybody to really access. Even today, Charedim have trouble understanding it, right? Like even the Charedim who are becoming more nationalist, they don't embrace this Torah. They don't really engage with this Torah. They're more kind of becoming Kahanistim. Like when a Haredi becomes nationalist, it becomes like a Kahanist, because Kahanism is basically Haredi Torah with nationalism. Like Rav Kook's Torah is a whole different thing that's rooted in Kabbala and an understanding of how Hashem's running the world and how we're meant to participate. And so what happens? This Torah that was the exclusive property of giants becomes accessible to the nation. And suddenly you have dozens and dozens of Torah institutions teaching this Torah, including Mechon Mir, right? And suddenly it's understandable to guys like us that we can actually come and learn this Torah because Yerushalayim was liberated. Because Am Yisrael came back to Yerushalayim Shelmata, material Jerusalem, terrestrial Jerusalem. We came back. So this Torah is suddenly accessible to the nation once again. And I don't know if we want to say, I mean, maybe it's something we don't want to say because of the stigma attached in a lot of Jewish spaces. The Zealots were considered bad guys. Why are the Zealots considered bad guys? Different reasons, different people. The Haredim consider them bad guys because they've kind of cast them as like secular Zionists, right? The modern Orthodox consider them bad guys because they're Jewish fundamentalists, right? Like they're, for the most part, the Zealots are not considered. And again, we had to present them as bad guys at the time because the Romans wanted to know, are you guys out? We had to create. Josephus and the Chachamim both had an interest in creating the impression that the Zealots do not represent the people of Israel. They're a tiny fringe minority, right? Why did we want to create that impression? So the Romans wouldn't punish the entire Jewish people for what happened. We cost them so much in blood and treasure. No one fought the Romans like we did, right? And so to prevent them from taking out their anger on the entire Jewish people everywhere, not just in our country, throughout the diaspora as well, we had to create this idea that it's not all the Jews, it's just the Zealots. They're just this like radical minority. Right? But now, so it's like not everybody wants to say, well, we're the Zealots. But the truth is, I think maybe we are. I think that it's possible. I think I've just made the argument. But one could make the argument for saying that the Talmidei of Kook, the real students of Rav Kook, who understand that we have an obligation to have sovereignty. Oh, remember, we're saying the only difference between the Pharisees and the Zealots is to basically hold by the Ramban and to say that we have an obligation in every generation to free our land from foreign rule and have Jewish independence here, because our mission in history demands that we have possession over Eretz Yisrael. Yeah. Right? So if we're taking that position, if we're the ones taking that position, and not just taking the position for security reasons, Chabad also takes that position. And even though Chabad are very influenced by Kabbala in a psychological, not a philosophical, but a psychological way, they also say we have to hold on to our entire land, but for security reasons, for pikuach nefesh reasons. They don't give you, Chabad, I've never heard Chabad give a spiritual answer for what, as opposed to Rav Avram Azulai, the Kabbalist of Hebron, who in the Chesed Avraham writes that the window through which Hashem's bracha enters our world is determined by how much of Eretz Yisrael is possessed by Am Yisrael. Meaning the more territory we possess, the larger the window that Hashem's bracha comes into the world through. Right? That's a spiritual answer. Right? That's a spiritual answer why we need to possess the land. Chabad has a not spiritual answer for that. They have spiritual answers for almost everything else. But for this, they have a very, they have a very security-oriented answer. So, but if we're saying that the definition of the Zealot movement is basically most scholars actually call it the radical left of the Pharisees, right? They're also fighting a class struggle in addition to an anti-imperial struggle, right? But we can say that if the only difference from the Pharisees and the Zealots is this insistence that we possess the land and the willingness to fight to keep our land free from foreign rule, then we can say that we're the Zealots. And to understand the spiritual importance of that, not just to say we want to keep our land because we want land, because we're just a bunch of nationalists, it's that we see that there's a deep spiritual importance to Am Yisrael possessing Eretz Yisrael. That we can only fulfill our mission in history and really partner with Hashem in bringing the world to the awareness of Hashem's oneness when we are a Mamlechet Kohanim the Goy Kadosh, and you can only be a Mamlechet Kohanim the Goy Kadosh when you have possession over all of Eretz Yisrael.
You're saying that the Zealots became the Zohar.
Essentially, I would say Rabbi Shimon bar-Yoḥai encoded the worldview of the Zealots into the Zohar in a way that wouldn't get anybody in trouble.
Because as far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Zealots did not survive.
The what?
The Zealots did not survive.
No, they were driven underground. But we can say, I'm arguing that they survived in the Ramban, in the Ramchal, in the Maharal, in the Gra.
Through the Zohar.
Yeah. I'm saying that's how.
Right.
That was the Torah of the Zealots hidden in the Kabbalistic writings.
So
to be unpacked only in 1967.
What happens in the Middle Ages? They go seriously off the derech with the Kabbala, and Kabbala is almost banned.
There's a lot of misunderstandings of it. It's dangerous. But I'm making the argument that the correct understanding is the understanding of the Ramban and the Ramchal and the Maharal and the Vilna Gaon and the Rav Kook down to Rav Yehuda and his Talmidim.